On Christmas Day, Russia launched an attack against Ukraine's energy and electrical infrastructure. The world was outraged. Yesterday, the Russians shot down an Azerbaijan commercial aircraft, and many lost their lives. Again, the world is outraged. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it was adopted by a vote of the UN General Assembly, and that sets forth a number of individual personal rights that each one of us has. It is expected that the member states of the United Nations, or the countries of the world, will protect those rights. The horrible things that I just told you that Russia has done recently, just the tip of the iceberg. They're offenses against international law and against humanitarian principles and against human rights are legion. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk to you about some of the UN General Assembly resolutions that were passed um, as a result of the Russian aggression, the illegal invasion, the immoral invasion by Russia of Ukraine. Before I do, the UN General Assembly, when they pass a resolution, it can mean many things. It can set standards of conduct, it can be recommendations for action, it can have legal significance as a law. It can also, too, provide directions. It can commemorate or make a record of things that have happened. It can reinforce international law or principles. But I think most importantly, a vote of a UN General Assembly is the considered will of the community of nations that exists on this earth. And the United Nations has made more apparent this community of nations, this community of countries. And it has brought all of us together, and it has brought peace and security and prosperity and human rights to most of the world, if not all of the world, in some amount or another. So let's talk about some of these resolutions. Um, there was UN General Assembly Resolution 77 229, which was adopted December of 2022, and there was probably one that was just adopted this month, but I don't have that. I will check. UN General Assembly Resolution 77 229, adopted December of 2022, urge Russia to immediately cease its aggression and unconditionally withdraw its armed forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Russia was also told to cease its efforts of preventing residents of Crimea from participating in the cultural life of their communities. Russia was told to stop the criminal prosecution of Crimean residents for resisting conscription and mobilization into the Russian armed forces, to repeal the decision regarding the simplified procedure for acquiring Russian citizenship for orphans and children left without parental care, to stop the transfer of Ukrainian children to the territory of the Russian Federation, and to take all appropriate measures for their safe return and family reunification. The UN noticed the following: that there is an indication of the use of the territory of Crimea for further aggression by the Russian Federation and attempts to illegally annex the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions. The UN noticed that there was a failure of the Russian Federation to comply with the 2022 interim order of the International Court of Justice regarding cessation of hostilities. In other words, Russia didn't stop the war, which it could have, and it was told to. Condemnation of inciting hatred in Russia against Ukraine and Ukrainians, Eastern Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Crimean Tatars, Muslims, Jehovah Witnesses, public activists, spreading the calls for atrocities against Ukrainians in the mass media, spread of disinformation aimed at justifying aggression against Ukraine, in particular through the education system, the adoption of new legislation of the Russian Federation aimed at refusing residents of Crimea the right to peaceful protest. All of these things were condemned. All of these things were noticed by the UN under Resolution 77/229. The next resolution from December of 2023 is 78/221. And it focused on violations of human rights in the Crimean Peninsula. And it noted that Russia was waging a war of aggression against Ukraine, and Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine was illegal. The resolution invoked the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It noted that the illegal practice of the Russian Federation regarding the arbitrary detention and capture of civilian hostages in the occupied territories. It noted the destruction of Kakova hydropower plant, the violent actions of the Russian Federation at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which may have catastrophic consequences not only for Ukraine but also for other countries, the use of occupied territories to carry out missile and unmanned aerial vehicle attacks in the rest of Ukraine, the undermining of food security through attacks on Ukraine's civilian seaports and their infrastructure, means of navigation, grain terminals, attempts to block Ukrainian ports, threats to use of force against civilian vessels, condemnation of the forcible transfer of children and other civilians within the occupied territories, and their deportation to the Russian Federation. In addition, the resolution urged the Russians to respect freedom of opinion, association, and peaceful assembly without discrimination on any grounds other than those permissible under international law. So the UN is noting a number of violations by the Russians. By noting them, they're saying that you shouldn't do this, you can't do this anymore. Okay. The United Nations Security Council has the primary responsibility for the purposes of the UN, mainly for our purposes of discussion today, for the purposes of preventing war and bringing peace. Well, there's 5 permanent members on the UN Security Council: the US, UK, France, China, and Russia. So these are the 5 people, the 5 countries who are responsible for keeping the peace. Well, Russia wages and started and waged an illegal, aggressive war. So right there's a fundamental failing by Putin and by Russia to fulfill its treaty obligations to keep the peace. All humanity has always wanted is peace. This is something everybody through the ages has desired and wanted. All the religions have said we want peace. And Russia, under Putin, was in the position to keep the peace, but he chose to wage a war of aggression and violate the peace. And he's one of the 5 guardians of the peace. So it's very egregious what Putin and Russia has done. And it puts the lie to any claim that Putin's a Christian or Russia's Christian. Puts a total lie to that claim. I mean, Christianity has always wanted a peaceful, unified world. And for him to wage aggressive war when he's given the responsibility of keeping the peace is egregious. Okay, so as a result of Russia's aggression, the UN Security Council isn't going to be able to pass anything that directs the end of the war, because Russia will always veto what it doesn't like. And when the UN Security Council directs something, then action can be taken by the community of nations. So that didn't happen. And so we were kind of in a situation like in 1950 with the resolution for peace. The same situation happened during the Korean War. I believe it was China that vetoed any efforts to bring peace in the Korean Peninsula. So there was a resolution that was passed that basically gave the General Assembly the power to act on behalf of the international community to bring peace. So this is what you had or have right now with the current war um, between Russia and Ukraine. It's a similar Uniting for Peace resolution. And so what happened was, or what happened now, there are a number of emergency session resolutions which make mention of the situation and issue directives basically to end the war. So the first emergency session resolution 11/1, I'll just call them 11/1, 2, 3, etc., issued March 2, 2022, and it condemned the special military operation, which is psyops by the Russians for invasion. It condemned the special military operation of the Russian Federation in Ukraine as the use of force by one country against another, which is contrary to the United Nations Charter and is recognized as aggression. It pointed to the military offensive, unprecedented during recent decades in Europe in terms of its scale, and declared that urgent action is needed to save this generation from the scourge of war. And the involvement of Belarus in committing aggression is also condemned. I want to go back to that word special military operation. That is psyops. That's disinformation. And it serves a number of purposes, which I'll get into later. But in Russia, if you criticize the war, you get a 15-year prison sentence. If you say that there's a war, you get a 15-year prison sentence. So you have to use this euphemism, special military operation, which is all part of Russian disinformation and other psychological warfare tricks that they use quite a bit, and they use to some effect. So Resolution ES 11-1 urged Russia to immediately cease the use of force against any member state, immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw its armed forces from the territory of Ukraine, and reverse the decision to recognize the independence of certain districts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Additionally, Russia was called to observe the Minsk agreements, return to work in the Normandy format and trilateral contact group for the implementation of these agreements, comply with the terms of international humanitarian law, and ensure the population's access to humanitarian aid and the protection of civilian populations and medical personnel. Emergency Resolution 11/2 was entitled Humanitarian Consequences of Aggression Against Ukraine, and it repeated the prior resolution's provisions and stated that the Russian military invasion of Ukraine has humanitarian consequences unprecedented in Europe in recent decades, and Russia was told to comply with international humanitarian law. Resolution 11/4, Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, defending the principles of Charter of the United Nations, was adopted October of 2022. The resolution went on to say the recognition by the Russian Federation of the independence of so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic on 21 February 2022, and the admission of 4 regions of Ukraine into the Russian Federation on 29 September 2022, as well as referendums on 23 and 27 September 2022, were declared illegal and incompatible with the United Nations Charter. Such actions and decisions have no validity under international law and do not form the basis for any alteration of the status of these regions of Ukraine. And Russia is urged to immediately and unconditionally repeal its decisions of 21 February and 29 September 2022 and withdraw its military units from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Resolution 11-5 from November of 2022 recognized the consequences of aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine as being human casualties, displacement of civilians, destruction of infrastructure and natural resources, loss of state and private property, economic disaster. The Russian Federation should be held accountable for all violations of international law in or regarding Ukraine, and it must be held accountable for all its internationally illegal actions, including aggression itself. And this must include reparations for losses and damage of any nature caused by these actions. International register will be created. When the UN was formed, it was formed with the purpose of stopping these kind of wars. And like I said before, it required 5 big guys, permanent members, to make sure there wouldn't be aggressive war. And guess what? One of those members, Russia, is waging an aggressive war against the UN Charter. It's shameful. It's shameful. What that shows, and it's kind of a sidelight here, what that shows is how can you make a peace treaty with the current leadership of Russia? How can you trust them? Okay, now there are a number of other institutions, reports that have reported on the suffering. The United Nations, the UNHCR, United Nations Humanitarian, UNHCR, I forget what it is. The UNHCR Refugee Agency, United Nations Refugee Agency, reports that the situation is dire in Ukraine. There's a lot of suffering. It states, quote, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 has resulted in the loss of life, separation of family members, loss of homes, belongings, savings, and jobs. Civilian infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed. Supply and access to gas, electricity, and fuel has been disrupted. Attacks by missiles, rockets, and drones continue to pose a risk to the safety and security of millions of Ukrainians. Approximately one-third of Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes, and around 3.7 million are currently displaced within the country, while some 6.8 million are displaced as refugees abroad. The humanitarian needs inside Ukraine continue to grow as the war persists, with an estimated 12.7 million people in need of multi-sectional humanitarian assistance. And that was from November of 2022, I believe. So the offenses committed by Putin and Russia are enormous. The human catastrophe that he has brought because of his aggressive war is shameful. It's disgraceful. It cannot be defended by anyone, and it cannot be allowed to sit there in silence. We have to talk about this, and we have to tell people what is going on. And that is what I am doing today, and to let you know that this should grieve everyone's heart. Now, some people aren't going to talk about it, and we know why. But we talk about it here. Thank you.